All right, start with an easy one to get things going. What was your dream job growing up?
Growing up, I wanted to be a veterinarian.
And what was your first role after graduation? Where did you get from veterinarian to where you actually started working?
My dream of being a veterinarian was when I was much younger, and then based on life experiences, that was no longer a goal once I hit my teenage years, so I didn't pursue it.
So what was their first job after you got out of school?
The first real permanent job or long-term job I had was I worked with adults with developmental disabilities, and I worked during the period of time when they were deinstitutionalizing in Connecticut.
Okay, would you consider that like your first professional job, like your first job of intent, or what would you consider your first professional job?
That would definitely be my first professional job. I started to waitress while I was in high school because I had been on my own and I needed to pay my bills, so I had waitressed for several years, but I was 3 or 4 years out of high school when I started that job.
What were some of your main responsibilities in that position?
I was responsible for educating the community on, again, it was at the time where they were deinstitutionalizing. So it was the era where you didn't go into the grocery store and have a person with a disability bagging your groceries. My job was to kind of educate the community and reintegrate the people into the community. So I had to train employers, I had to train the people with disabilities, and I had to train the staff.
What made you decide to go into that field?
I was working as a waitress, and there was a crew of people with disabilities from that agency that came in with a job coach, and I saw them every day, and it sparked my interest, and I didn't know that that's what I wanted to do, but I really enjoyed it.
So how did you go about getting the job from where you started being interested? Like, how did you actually get to the point where, like, you ended up working for them?
I think I kind of got lucky because I talked a lot with the coach that was working as a job. There was a job coach, and I asked a lot of questions, and I filled out the application. Back then it was a paper application, and I got an interview.
So what were other than waitressing, did you have like any experience or qualifications going into that position?
I did not.
How did that make you feel like when you started being that way compared to like your coworkers?
It was really an entry-level position. It wasn't. You didn't need a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree at that point in time to do it. You probably would now. So I felt very much like a peer.
What are some other ways that like things have changed in that area since that time when you first started working in that field?
Therapies and most of that community is now integrated. So now it's at higher level of care is not the right way to say it. But before it was like a minimum standard for the people that had the disabilities. Just to get them back into the community was huge. Now it's about trying to offer them better services and help them to have a higher quality of life, which then adds in the educational piece.
So what was to help you complete that role, like what did the organization give you as far as like training and stuff like that to help you be able to do your job?
That job at that time was on the job training. Is that what you're asking?
Any type of development that whether it be on the job training, mentoring, whatever they may have done?
Yes, they did on the job training, and I went through a lot of just regular trainings, like a first aid and some different, behavioral type.
Let's see. Was there like a particular like organization or company you wanted to work for, or was it kind of just like the opportunity came up?
At that time, that was the only agency in the area. It was in Manchester. It was called Manchester Association for Retarded Citizens, which obviously is no longer the correct terminology. But I lived in Manchester, and I worked in Manchester, and I had gone to school in Manchester. So,
what did you like most about that work?
I liked the fact that I moved up and took on a lot more responsibility. And I liked the fact that I got to interact with all kinds of different people, from the people with the disabilities to the coaches to the employers.
So what kind of positions did it end up leading to?
So from there, I ended up in the staffing world in some way, shape, or form for most of the rest of my life. Coordinating things.
So you kind of like, it helped you like find purpose and...
I just naturally was good at doing certain things in that job, and so those natural talents kind of led me towards like dealing with diverse populations. You know, I could, in one day, I could be sitting down with the president of the company, and 3 hours later, I could be in the back room of McDonald's teaching somebody how to flip burgers. So it was just that diversity of it.
What was your least favorite thing about the position?
Bureaucracy.
Can you elaborate on that a little?
So, you know, the funding and I was privy to some of the information on some of the funding, and each person came with a dollar amount, and so based on that dollar amount, that would end up being what the person, what level of support the person might get, regardless of what level of support the person might need. So a person that was in a wheelchair would have less money attached to them, so that they were less apt to be employed in a supported environment because of the dollar amount.
So being a professional without a degree, do you feel like that's hindered you, or like there's been any special challenges you've had to come over being a professional that doesn't have that education?
Definitely. Just all my life I've had to fight to get into a position, a decent position, based on I've got the lived experience, but I don't have the degrees.
So what were some strategies you used to like overcome that in interviews, or like even before the interviews?
Always focusing on all of my experience, and you know, before an interview, selling myself as, you know, being the mature, taking the positive aspects, and focusing on, while I wasn't in school, I was busy learning, or that I had the track record, you know, of I've never been unemployed. I've always had a job, one or two, and they've always been decent jobs. So focusing on that.
Were there any common questions or themes that would come up repeatedly, like around that issue?
I didn't really have a lot of people ask me why I hadn't gone to school. I don't know if that's because maybe it wasn't appropriate in the interview. I've had a lot of people in general ask me, but not necessarily in a job interview.
So what would be the reason that like you chose to go straight to work?
Family circumstances. My parents sold the house and I had nowhere to live.
Oh, so you were just basically forced to grow up really quickly.
Exactly. I was on my own at 16. I was in 11th grade of high school, and I was paying rent, and I had all full bills before I graduated high school, and so then it just perpetuated into.
So how did like working that job, you're dealing with difficult people, different social circumstances, like how would that affect you outside of work and like your general life?
Well, at that point in time, in the drawer up front. Excuse me. Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
So, where's my thought? I don't remember what I asked. That was a good question. I can't remember what I asked. So whatever. We'll just move on.
Difficulties based on.
What was the question before that? I made that question off the top of my head. How it affects your general lifestyle, like the different.
Oh, thank you. So that was not a healthy period of time for me. I was living in a very unhealthy fashion during that time. So I let the stress. It was a pretty stressful environment. And I let the stress lead me to very unhealthy lifestyles.
So, like, not having the education and, like, not living healthy, you were able to overcome that and get professional positions. What would you say allowed you to do that?
Perseverance more than anything. So if I was applying, I would just have to keep looking and looking and looking and stay at the job I was at, regardless of the circumstances, until I could put out enough energy and to get another interview and another job.
So, like, when you were doing that looking, was there like a certain criteria you were looking for in companies, or like certain types of organizations you were looking into?
I was looking to get out of the nonprofit and into the profit at one point in time. And that's what I ended up doing. That's how I ended up getting into the staffing industry. Um, I, based on my unhealthy lifestyle and the job, I was definitely at a place of burnout. And so I, at that point in time, I thought I wanted to work for a for-profit company.
So you were able to like move up in your field. Do you feel like you've been limited in how far you actually can move up, or have you felt like you've been able to like meet your goals for where you wanted to be?
A little bit of both. So I feel like I've been limited, but it's also, at this point in my life, it's a self-limitation because I haven't had a lot of opportunities because I've always had to support myself and didn't have a second income. So it's been hard to try to like go to school full time or even part time and work full time. But had I put more effort into it, I could have started to do that 10 years ago and I could have education now. So some of it's a self-limiting thing.
So how has that first job helped you to get to where like the position you're in now?
So all of the skills that I learned and did in that first job are still applicable. I don't do the same things, but the skills necessary to be able to work with diverse populations. I was in charge of large numbers of things like transportation for 150 individuals. So when I present that information to an employer, if I'm capable of doing that, I'm still capable of it. So it's really the nature of the type of things I did. Because you can either do that or you can't.
So what advice would you give someone like that's gone through your circumstances that was trying to like enter into the job market now?
Go to school. Go directly to school. Or don't be discouraged if you don't, but
Do you feel like things have changed since the time like when you entered the workforce to now where like that's more of a necessity?
It's absolutely changed. I don't know if it's more of a necessity. I know that I've changed as I've gotten older, and so my goals and what I'm maybe striving for have changed. But the employment market based on education, it's ebbed and flowed over the years.
So that kind of leads into this one. If you could do things all over again, would you choose the same path for yourself?
Yes, because it's the only path I know, and I'm okay with where I am right now. If I were to try to change the path, then I don't know where I'd end up as the result, so I would go with what I know.
So your current position is slightly different than like where a lot of your experiences. Do you mind sharing like how you came to be in your current position?
So I've been in recovery from alcoholism for a significant period of time, and somewhere around I keep forgetting you're going to transcribe.
No, you're good. I'm just making sure it's still running.
So that has driven a lot of the changes, and it's driven a lot of the decisions in my life while I was actively an alcoholic, and then again into my sobriety. And there were times where I had to leave jobs because the stress level was too high, and I was worried that would affect my sobriety. And then at some point, kind of serendipitously, I ended up getting to work in the field of addiction recovery, which then led me to the job that I'm at now.
How were some like strategies you used in like getting that first position? versus like getting the position you're in now? How is that process different?
So the first time I was a young person, and I was just looking for an entry level position, and I was happy with having a full-time Monday through Friday job with benefits. And now, based on all my years of working experience, I knew exactly what I wanted to do and what I didn't want to do, and I knew exactly what I was willing to do and what I wasn't willing to do. So there was a lot more thought and effort put into. And I also was, before I came to this current job, I was gainfully employed in a good job for almost 8 years. So I made a very conscious decision to try to apply for this job.
So, what is it about this position and organization that made you consciously make that decision?
So the organization that I work for promotes recovery, and it promotes recovery in all different ways. And again, the natural progression of my own personal recovery had led me to want to advocate more for it and try to help more people.
So, were you like actively looking for work, or was it just something where like you saw a position you were interested in and jumped at the opportunity?
So I had been familiar with this organization from the job that I had before, and I periodically would look for, I wanted to come and work for this organization at some point in time, but I wasn't going to jump from one job to another unless it was going to be at least a lateral change. So I just periodically looked for postings and came across this posting and applied for it. And so it was a conscious decision.
So, what did you see like early in your career? Like, how what were your expectations early in the career for like where you were gonna end up compared to like where you actually did end up?
That kind of ebbed and flowed too. So early in my career, I was happy to have an entry level job, and then I got promoted up into like middle management at that job. And then when I left there, I ended up kind of middle management at a staffing company, and then I got promoted to the operations manager. And at that point in time, that was my drive was finance and title and power. And then as time went on, that became very less important to me, and always a driving factor has been the ability to be able to support myself.
So the change from like drive and power to service type work's a big change. Can you talk about that a little bit?
During the time that I was working for that staffing company, I was in the height of my alcoholism, and I didn't. I thought that I was performing at a much higher level than I actually was performing at, and so I kind of glorified what I perceived myself to be, and I liked. It was really a perception that I had created. My position was I had a lot of responsibility, but the circumstances were I was working in Hartford in a basement with no windows in the heart of the ghetto, and it was a very violent environment. But instead of looking at that part of it at that point in my life, I looked at it as I was the operations manager. Look how powerful I am.
Right. One more I kind of missed out. I want to go back to. So like interviewing for positions and like looking positions once again with like the lacking education, did you find like the process would take longer, or like how did you go about like what did that process look like for you compared to like what you were seeing from peers and other people in your field?
Good question, but I never really looked at what other people were doing so much as I just was able to kind of not stay in my lane, but I never really looked to see. I think that if I had better education, I probably would have been applying for better jobs. So I don't think that I really have anybody to compare to, because I always applied at what I knew I could be hired at, and I always checked to make sure that the requirements were, if they wanted a bachelor's degree, it was a preferred qualification that could be substituted with the work experience. So that limited where I applied. Whereas my peers, if they had the education, we wouldn't have been applying for the same jobs.
All right. That's mostly what I need, but I need to put in something cute here to wrap it up. Was there anything like you would like to add or speak on the subject before we end the interview?
So, so I definitely felt, most of my life limited by not having the education, but at the end of the day, I've always had decent jobs where I've been able to support myself, and I've had benefits, and, and at the end of the day, I am the master of, I could have done things differently to end up with an education and then end up in a different place, but I'm very happy at the place I ended up.
All right. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.